in chapter 16. I'm going to start at verse 35. And we catch up with Paul and Silas and now they have Timothy and Luke with them. And they're on their second journey. And they have sailed from the port city of Troas, which is on the western coast of Turkey. And they sail across the Aegean Sea and they end up in the city of Philippi, which is in Macedonia. And after exorcising a demon from a slave girl, and thereby ending the source of income for her owners, Paul and Silas are beaten, and they find themselves in jail for advocating a breaking of the law by proclaiming a new God without official Roman authorization. And so even without this formal trial and being found guilty of a crime, they find themselves in jail. But an earthquake provides an opportunity for everyone in the jail to escape, but none of them do. Good morning.
Good morning.
But none of them escape, and Paul then interrupts the head jailer's suicide attempt. And in gratitude, the jailer takes Paul and Silas out of the prison and he tends to their wounds and feeds them. And this all leads to the jailer and his household becoming believers. So Rick, can we start with you and read 35 through 40?
Now when day came, the chief magistrate sent their policemen, saying, "Release those men." And the jailer reported these words to Paul, saying, "The chief magistrates have sent to release you. Now therefore come out and go in peace." But Paul said to them, "They have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are sending us away secretly? No, indeed, but let them come themselves and bring us out." And the policemen reported these words to the chief magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. And they came and appealed to them, and when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. And when they went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia, and when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed.
So here we have kind of an interesting finale to this whole episode here. At some point, Paul and Silas must have gone back to the jail, most likely to keep the jailer out of trouble. And for whatever reason, we aren't told, the magistrates decided to release Paul and Silas. Apparently they thought they'd had enough. But their whole message, at least as recorded, is, let those men go. That's it. And the jailer adds, go in peace. And the magistrates probably didn't give a rip whether Paul and Silas were at peace about it or not. But Paul's not really very happy about all of this. So he points out the things that the magistrates did wrong. Paul and Silas were uncondemned, meaning that they had never been pronounced guilty of a crime. And they were publicly stripped and beaten, not only very physically painful, but also humiliating. And they were thrown into this dark, filthy, smelly prison and placed in the stocks. And this was a punishment usually reserved for the lower classes. And to top all of that off, they did this to Roman citizens. And this complaint gets back to the magistrates, and they're quite afraid, and for good reasons. As mentioned before, none of these things are allowed to be done by law to a Roman citizen without a formal trial and being judged guilty of a crime. And this could have gotten the magistrates in a whole lot of hot water. And Paul's insistence on being escorted out of the jail is not just a matter of personal pride here. Paul is being strategic. Now, he's concerned for the public reputation of the gospel message and for the standing of the new church that had just been developed there in that city. So he insists on public vindication. And otherwise, him being viewed as a troublemaker and lawbreaker would have made it a whole lot more difficult for the church in Philippi for years to come, possibly. Right? So he wanted to make it made clear publicly that a mistake had been made. And so they get their wish, but they also get an urgent request from the magistrates to get out of town. And so apparently, Paul and Silas didn't think this was unreasonable, so after the hugs and encouragement, they head down the Ignatian Way. That was that road that goes across from Macedonia all the way across to the
I'm glad you brought that
Sea.
up, because it's something that, it's one of those events, it's like, because it's like, it was pretty clear that Paul didn't do it for personal vindication, because that's just not Paul. There's something else he was after to either, and I'm glad you touched on it, because I'd always wondered about that. I always thought, because if he did this for the protection of the church, this is an issue that the magistrates don't want to touch anymore. They want to bury this thing, and that means they have to leave the church alone. Because if they started to come down on the church or persecute the church, then this issue comes right back up, and it's not in their interest to bring this thing up. So it's probably just to let them go do their thing, at least from the magistrate's part. Let them do their thing, stay out of it, and if anybody got upset saying you need to stop them, it's like, no, I don't wanna touch this. This is one of those political untouchables, and so, because it's not something that just goes away with Paul, it's something that hangs over them. It's kinda like, do you really wanna bring this up again? And so anyway, thanks for touching on it, I was curious, cause there's always like one of those looming things that, it's unusual that Paul would do that, but you can see the strategy.
Yeah, like I said, he's being strategic, and he says, hey, look, we've got the church's reputation is at stake here. And we've got a brand new baby church here, and we're trying to grow. And you know, this is could be a severe hindrance to it down the road.
Yeah.
So we want to straighten that out. Okay, let's go to chapter 17. And April, would you read 1 through 4?
Now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Then Paul, as his custom was, went into them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus whom I preach to you is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas.
So this Amphipolis and Apollonia were rest stops, and we're talking about this area right up here. This is Macedonia, this is Greece, all of this is what is now Greece, anyway. But we're talking about this area right up in here. Okay, so we're going from Philippi across this road to Thessalonica. Okay, all right, so that's the road that they're on, and
Can you explain to me, it says they're Roman citizens, but Silas was from down in Jerusalem, wasn't he?
Silas came from.
Didn't he go up and tell them, carry the word up to it was okay not to be circumcised when he went up?
Yes.
And then
But
that's when he Paul picked Silas, so how is he a Roman? I guess I don't understand the
Well,
Roman citizen
see,
political.
Roman citizenship was, it depends, there was different ways to become a Roman citizen. One was to be born one. Okay.
Like born in Rome, you mean? Or?
Yeah, born in, as a child of Roman citizens that are citizens somewhere in the empire. You would be considered a Roman citizen. There were also ways in which a person who was in a slavery situation could buy their way out of that and become a Roman citizen. And another way was for cities to be declared Roman cities.
Oh.
And by virtue of being a citizen of that city, you were then declared a Roman citizen. That's how Paul got his, because he was from Tarsus, and Tarsus was declared a Roman city. They were often done either for strategic reasons, or sometimes because they were doing something for the sake of the empire. Okay, and so Rome then would declare, the emperor would say, okay, you are a Roman city, and that was as a reward for whatever it was they were doing.
Okay.
Okay, and
So it was an honor to be a Roman citizen?
yeah, it was. It was an honor, and there were certain privileges as well. And so, we just saw that in Philippi. There were certain things that you couldn't do to a Roman citizen, whereas you could get away with it if the person wasn't. Okay, so I thought that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, but anyway, this Amphipolis and Apollonia were rest stops between Philippi and Thessalonica. It was a journey of about 95 miles. And this Thessalonica had been declared a free city. In fact, it was one of those, meaning that it had some autonomy, and it was also the capital of Macedonia here. It was a very Roman city, but it had an awful lot of idol worship going on as well. And so Paul and Silas did their usual thing, and they started in the synagogue, and they managed to survive 3 Sabbaths in the synagogue before they wore out their welcome there. And one of the themes they tried was to convince the Jews that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead. And the concept of a suffering Messiah would have been foreign to those Jews in that city. Now, their idea of Messiah, and you know this already, was one who would come in power and free the Jews from Roman authority. Now, the idea of Jesus suffering and dying would have disqualified him from messiahship, if that's a word. Okay? At least in their eyes anyway. And since Jesus suffered and died, they would have needed to get over this obstacle to believe in Jesus as the Christ. Okay? And so, and the resurrection was Paul's way of getting over it. It was the proof, and it still is even today. And even though they would have been familiar with the suffering servant passages in Isaiah 53, the Jews historically applied the suffering servant to their nation and not the Messiah. Okay, so they didn't buy that. And it says that Paul and Silas were successful, but not entirely. But notice it also says a significant number of women joined the church. Now, historically, converts to Judaism and converts to Christianity, whether they were Gentiles or Jews to begin with, the majority were women. And a couple of reasons that have been suggested for this. One is that Christianity significantly raised the status of women in their societies. And historically, too, the converts to Judaism, the other would have been that it would have been easier socially and culturally for women to become Christians than it would have been for the men.
Mm-hmm.
Because the men are out in the society, they're out in the work venue and that type of thing. So it just would have been easier. Or it could have just been that the women had more sense, which is probably the case. Okay, Candy, would you read 5 through 9, please?
Okay, but the Jews, becoming jealous and taking along some wicked men from the marketplace, formed a mob and set the city in an uproar. And coming upon the house of Jason, they were seeking to bring them out to the people. And when they did not find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have upset the world have come here also." And Jason has welcomed them, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. And they stirred up the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. And when they had received the pledge from Jason and the others, they released them.
Once again here, we see the wording the Jews, not meaning all the Jews. It's talking about the leadership here. The leadership sought to put an end to this nonsense. And notice that jealousy was again the motive. They were losing power and influence to these nobodies who were preaching heresy as far as they were concerned. Now notice also who they get to assist them in this. These are likely unemployed men from the working classes who tended to hang out in the marketplace waiting for a job. And of those men, they chose men of poor character. And so the leadership gets these men fired up, and by mob action, they cause an uproar in the city. And so the mob heads off to Jason's house, apparently because Paul and Silas had been staying there, or it could have been the location of a home church, but they weren't there. And so the mob settled for Jason and some of the other believers. Now remember that getting the accused person to court was the responsibility of the accusers. And when they got there, they shouted all their accusations out. And notice the Jews in their accusations are relying on Roman laws, not the laws of the Jews. Because they knew the city officials wouldn't care a fig about people breaking their own laws, the Jewish laws. And it is apparent that by what the accusers said, that Paul and Silas's reputation had followed them to Thessalonica. Okay? And it wasn't a good reputation, at least in the eyes of the people there. And the charge of causing unrest in the Pax Romana was a serious one and could even lead to one's execution for doing that. And the Romans wanted things to remain peaceful and quiet in their empire. And so even Jason's harboring these troublemakers was a serious offense. And in this city, people were serious about their devotion to the empire, to the emperor, excuse me. There was an imperial temple there, and they even had coins made with his image on it. And so even speaking of another king in the empire was a treasonable offense that was punishable by death. And the money as security for the accused was like a bond guaranteeing that there would be no more trouble from Paul's preaching. And if there were, then those would have had to forfeit the money. And so practically speaking, for these two not to continue stirring up trouble for the new believers would mean Paul and Silas would really logically have to leave town.
You know, in our view of things, we would look at that as like this was a failure situation, but actually a church is established
It is,
there.
yes.
And,
There is a
you know,
church there.
You know, books are written and communication from Paul to them.
Yeah.
I mean, so it was turned to good.
Yes,
I mean, there
absolutely.
was still good that came from it,
Mhm.
so.
And all of this, I think, you know, it may have been what Paul had been referring to as Satan's hindrance when he writes 1 Thessalonians, it occurs in chapter 2. And really, it's not hard to imagine Satan's hand in all of this. Joyce, would you want to pick this up in verse 10, read 10 through 15, please?
Okay. As soon as it was night, the brothers sent Paul and Silas away to Berea. On arriving there, they went to the Jewish synagogue. Now the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. Many of the Jews believed, as did also a number of prominent Greek women and many Greek men. When the Jews in Thessalonica learned that Paul was preaching the word of God at Berea, they went there too, agitating the crowds and stirring them up. The brothers immediately sent Paul to the coast, but Silas and Timothy stayed at Berea. The men who escorted Paul brought him to Athens and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible.
The brothers in verse 10 probably is referring to the newcomers in the city. So off they go at night, and this is an indication of the danger they consider Paul and his company to be in, because people didn't normally leave a city at night. Okay, and it was also, in some circles, that was kind of considered a chicken's way out, to bug out in the middle of the night. Now, possibly due to the need to keep a low profile, they veer off the Ignatian way, and they travel 50 miles to Berea. And just like always there, they begin again in the synagogue. And Luke describes these Jews as being more noble. And the original meaning of the word was one of noble birth, or somebody who was well born. But it also come to mean someone who displayed noble behavior, such as being one who is open-minded and fair. Okay? And so I think Luke's inclusion of this here is to contrast the attitudes of those in Berea with those in Thessalonica where they just come from. And so the reaction of those there was, oh, good, here's something new. And I sense that in their noble bearing and the attitude of, okay, we'll give you a fair hearing, but we're gonna check it out. And check out what you're saying with Scripture, and that's what these Bereans did. And this is a good message for us too. So, when we come up against something that is different than what we think is doctrinally sound, we need to start turning pages. We need to let God reveal through His Word what's right and what's wrong, and not rely on someone else's or even our own made-up belief system. How often have you heard, well, I have my beliefs, or I have my idea of God, but the problem is that God may not even be real, and their beliefs might not get them where they need to go. And so the results of the Berean search was that they discovered Paul and Silas were right, and as a consequence, many believed. And Luke adds that this batch of new believers included a significant number of women, and I talked about that before, women and men of high social standing. And maybe this was Luke's way of saying some of the Bereans in the audience really were of noble birth. And so Paul and his company, they must have been in Berea long enough for word to travel from there back to Thessalonica, and for those in South Thessalonica to travel to Berea. So, but the crowd there gets stirred up again, and new believers have to send Paul away. And so Paul gets an escort to the sea, and some of his disciples ensure he makes the trip by ship all the way to Athens. Athens is, well, it's even on the map, it's right here. Athens is right here. This is the region of Achaia, or Achaia, depending on how you pronounce it. That's this region right here.
Why only Paul?
That's a good question. Well, Paul, I believe in this instance, I think we'll talk about this a little bit, was that Silas and Timothy stayed there in Berea. And Paul was escorted by other believers, and when they went with him by ship to make sure he arrived in Athens okay. That's
Wouldn't
what
they
I
have
think.
been just as much danger as him?
That's what I was thinking.
Those, possibly.
I would think Paul was kind of the face.
Yeah, he
the
was.
focal point. Everybody knew who Paul was, and so it's kind of like wherever Paul went, he became the lightning rod of the attention. And I'm sure they were aware of him, but I think they were more worried about Paul. So probably, I would think Paul would have been more the focal point than the others.
Yeah.
Not that they wouldn't be in danger, it's just that I think for them, it was clear that whatever the Bereans thought was going on, they thought it important to get him out of there.
That's right.
And they really weren't as worried about the others, but.
Mike,
Yes.
the other thing that verse I love, that passage, verse 11, that talks about the Bereans, is that it reminds me of the parable of the sower, and the seed that fell on the rocky place, was received with great joy. But what the Bereans did after that was they were the good soil too,
Sure.
that they were able to test and see, and they stayed in the Word daily,
Yeah.
and that's how they produced the crop. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, we'll see an example of that here again when he gets to Athens, about the difference between the good soil and the rocky ground. Well, it's kind of like you were brought up, exactly what happened from these verses, it really isn't clear, but what we get from First Thessalonians and later in Acts, this is kind of how it goes. Okay. Paul travels to Athens. He leaves Silas and Timothy behind in Berea, probably to look after the new church that's there in his absence. And then Paul calls for Silas and Timothy to join him in Athens, which they do. Paul then, out of concern for the churches he has just founded in Macedonia, sends Timothy back to Thessalonica to check on the church there in the midst of the persecution that's going on. Okay, so I don't know if you followed all of that, but that's kind of what, you have to pick that up from other places in the Bible to kind of figure out what went on. Let's see, Joyce, did you just read? Okay, Karen, did you? Yeah.
Timothy was from somewhere up in there, they picked him
Yes.
up.
Yes, Timothy
He
was
was
from
more of a
Nicaea,
citizen that they,
right about here.
so was he more acceptable to go back to Thessalonica, or just because Paul was the voice,
Well,
Timothy wasn't known as much, so he was.
that could
okay
be,
for-
but I think Paul placed an awful lot of faith in Timothy, because Timothy had a really good reputation back where he came from,
Right,
and he was a person that was just a person of deep faith. And so I think Paul just had a lot of confidence in his ability. And he was actually quite young, but Paul still thought that
That's
he
good.
could handle the job.
okay.
Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Well, how far?
To 21.
Okay. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? You're bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we'd like to know what they mean." All the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas.
Athens was actually the capital of Achaia, and it was known for its deep-thinking philosophers. And it's very artistically a very beautiful city. And lots of statues of the Greek gods, and they had magnificent temples there. The problem for Paul was that so much of this artistic beauty was tied to idolatry. And it was everywhere one looked. And he was deeply troubled at a city so devoted to false gods. And this wasn't good, because as it says in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 20. You want to read that for us, Rick?
2 verse 20 or 10? verse
Sorry,
20?
10, 20.
Okay, just wanna make sure I got the right one here, so.
Yeah, I stuttered.
No, but I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons.
Okay, so there you have it. This was Paul's idea, and it was really a very popular idea, that the demons, that all these idols, false gods, were represented by demons. And so, when you are dealing in that realm, you're actually dealing in a demonic realm. And so, Paul doesn't like any of this. And so, if you don't think this could happen in our country today, I want you to take a trip and walk around Las Vegas for a while. It will make you sick. Right here in our own country. So anyway, Paul goes to work by making a two-pronged attack here. One is the synagogue and the other is the marketplace. And it says he reasoned. And this is a good approach to witnessing in what was the birthplace of many of the Western world's philosophies. And some of those philosophies have continued even down to today. And it says he got the opportunity to engage proponents of two of the most popular philosophies of the day, Epicureanism and Stoicism. Now, just very briefly here, Epicureans believed that the proper goal of life was pleasure. And here's how they defined it. Pleasure was the lack of physical pain or emotional trauma. Not so much as in sensuality, but their philosophy, this is a philosophy that was very popular with the upper classes. And today we think of Epicureans as those who live, whose lives consist in seeking pleasure, but that wasn't the whole picture. It's much more complicated than that. Now, Stoics, on the other hand, believe that fate controlled destiny. And the best way to respond to this was to control the one thing that they could control, and that was one's attitude. And so they believe the challenges of life should be confronted with calmness and a lack of negative emotion. And so today we think of Stoics as those who tend to be emotionless about things, particularly negative things. Now, these are very simplified versions of these two philosophies here, okay? But Luke records the response of Paul's preaching. And the first one, the word babbler is a very interesting word picture. It literally means a seed picker, or one who picks at seeds. And the picture is one who picks at ideas, the way a chicken picks at seeds, and then spouts other people's ideas without really understanding them. This is what they're accusing Paul of.
Wow.
Now, the other response is this guy seems to be preaching foreign gods again. And as a result, they haul him off to the Areopagus. Now, the Areopagus was the city council, and it was composed of about 100 members. And the idea behind bringing Paul before this council was to get a determination on whether Paul was advocating for a foreign cult, or whether his preaching had any merit and he should be granted permission to publicly lecture.
Wasn't
That
that
was the
the
whole
statement
idea
of,
here.
the statement of bringing foreign gods almost an accusation, because foreign could also mean unauthorized.
Unauthorized, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
Yes, yes. you're
So it was
absolutely
kind of
correct.
a bit of an accusation, it could be dangerous.
It could be, and Paul needed to be really cautious here because this was the same court, although it was at a different time, that condemned Socrates and had him executed
Okay,
for advocating for foreign gods.
Because weren't you, the definition of an atheist then was that you just didn't accept the acceptable gods. Any rejection of them would mean you're an atheist, not that you didn't believe in a deity, it's just that you didn't believe in the right deities.
Correct.
Okay, right.
Yeah, there were the right ones and the ones that were not recognized.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yet there is a synagogue there, so there has some familiarity that there's this God,
Mhm.
because they're there,
Yeah.
so.
We don't know how active the Jews were in society there, but yes.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah, okay, Matt, could you do 22 through 28?
Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. For one man he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring."
In presenting his case, Paul begins with an ambiguous statement here. He calls them very religious, which could have had a positive meaning of being pious, or it could have had a negative meaning of being superstitious. And we don't really know which it is he means here. But he proceeds using this idea of an altar to an unknown God. Now, the existence of this altar comes from a time in ancient Athens when prayers and sacrifices to all the known gods was not enough to put an end to severe plague. And so a man from Crete by the name of Epimenides advised them to build altars to unknown gods so that the one who could affect things wouldn't get slighted or missed. Okay? Now, I don't recall the whole story, but it had to do with wherever sheep intended for slaughter laid down, that's where you built those altars
Oh,
to the unknown
interesting.
gods.
Oh.
Okay? Now, so Paul proceeds to use this as a way to introduce the real God, to denounce idol worship and proclaim the resurrection.
Don't you think he was also giving them a compliment, that,
That's-
kind of like,
It could be either. from the wording, it's impossible to tell, but you would think
Yeah,
that he would want to
Probably
butter them up just a
positive.
little bit, okay,
Yeah.
kind of get on their good side,
Right.
yeah.
It didn't seem to shut the conversation, at least whatever it was, they didn't seem to react to it right away, so.
Well, they'd be more apt to listen, because,
Right.
Yeah,
I would think.
So, anyway, I want you to notice how Paul introduces God here. He says, he is the creator God, and this includes the world, all that's in it, and he has lordship over all the heavens and the earth. And he doesn't need these temples. Interesting thing to say in Athens.
mhm.
Doesn't need these temples or anything else you can give him, as in sacrifices. He is the giver. He is the giver of things that include life, breath, and everything else. And all mankind comes from him. Now, I could have been referring to either Adam or Noah, and of course their wives played a minor supporting role in this. And so he's also the God who has sovereignty over the histories of nations. And these would include the rise and fall of successive empires like Greece and Rome. Okay? And because of all of this, the hope is that all people will attempt to find this God. I mean, why wouldn't you? And after all, if God is all these things, why would you not want to seek him, right? Now, the implication in verse 27, according to some commentators, is that some will find him and some will go off in the wrong direction. And even though this God is plainly right before your eyes. Now, in verse 28, rather than quote scripture, Paul quotes from the two poets here who would have been familiar to the audience. One is this same Epimenides here. And by quoting these two poets, Paul's not giving blanket approval to all these things that poets believe. He's picking and choosing here, okay? Let's see, Chris, would you read 29 through 34?
29 through 34.
Yes, please.
Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. The past God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." At that, Paul left the council. A few men became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others.
All right, so Paul's going to use all that he said to deliver his punchline. And this is what it is. It says, if the one true God is all this, how can you think he can be represented by anything humans can imagine or produce? He is much more than that. And even us mere mortals, his offspring, are so much more than idols of gold, silver, and stone. And if that's the case, how can one think that God can be represented in all these things? And which makes me wonder about the God that people create in their minds. The God they like, or the God who they think who ought to be. Humans can't begin to imagine all that God truly is. But we need to realize is that this God has revealed as much of himself to humanity as he deems necessary in his word and in his world. And it is futile and it is folly to attempt to create something else in your imagination. That God doesn't exist. Now, verse 30, Paul indicates that up until now, God's given him a free pass. But now the implication is with the coming of Jesus, God expects repentance. And because of what Paul has already said, I have to assume he's referring to their idol worship here. And the reason he gives is that there will come a day, and that time has already been determined by God, when the world, meaning the people in it, will be judged for their righteousness. And this implies they will be judged against a fixed standard of righteousness. And that standard will not only be Jesus, but he will also be the judge. And the proof of all this is that he was raised from the dead. And I get a sense from verse 30 that this kind of put a stop to the discussion.
That was a problem.
This was a little over the top for some of them to handle, I think, here. And some mocked and some left the door open to further talk. Like Karen said earlier, some seeds fall on the hard soil and some of them fall on the fertile ground. Paul wasn't responsible for the soil, only for the seeds.
Right.
That's the same with us. So out Paul goes, and there's no record of whether Paul was able to speak to this council again. It appears that Paul did not have an overwhelming success in Athens here. Some men, including one of who was a member of the Areopagus, and a woman named Damaris, and I don't know why these two are specifically mentioned here, but others could have meant anyone, could have been more council members, could have been more women, just more people, we don't really know. So,
But
with
you know,
that, yeah.
it's kind of interesting about this whole thing because it kind of carries 17 itself. If you look at it in total, is a really interesting challenge to the church because the church is introduced to the gospel. You have and is instantly opposed. You have the example, the Bereans, who then cling to the truth. And claim to it at 1711, and it's going to now become the standard of truth, what they're going to do. Paul goes to Athens, and he sees the idols, and it disturbs him, like it would disturb anybody. But now comes the challenge, and that's going to be, I know the truth, I see what's around me. How now do I engage that world with that truth? Because I've got a choice now. I'm at a crossroads. Do I just keep my mouth shut? And do I just stay quiet? And just kind of just stay off the radar screen and just kind of slide through? Hope nobody sees me as a Christian, kind of go? Or do I find a way to positively engage in a way, engage it? And that's what Paul did. So Paul engages them with the truth. And he does so in a way that takes them from where they are. And I don't want to talk about too much about yesterday because he employs a lot of those types of things where you learn about how to engage the truth with where they're at. And knowing that that's going to come at complete odds with where they're at, what they think. It's going to, a matter of fact, you're asking very proud and arrogant men on Areopagus who know everything to repent. I'm sure that's going to go really well.
Sure. And they already had
As a matter of fact, you're all wrong. It's kind of like
They have a lot of gods already.
yeah, it's kind of like,
there's another one.
and then you're going to throw on top of that the resurrection of the dead. It's like, okay, I can't deal with this anymore. So, but what's interesting is that he engages, but the measure of success wasn't the number of people that turned. It was the fact that they had been engaged and now are stuck with this unknown God.
Exactly.
That even though they may have sneered and walked away, they don't know what to do with this now. It's a problem now. He's left it at their doorstep that they have to reconcile. But you have some very prominent people and influential people who walk out of that to say, you know what, there's something to this, that now become the seeds of the body of Christ in Athens and elsewhere. So
Yeah.
it's like, so it really, you know, it's an interesting time, and Paul does this without his companions.
Yes,
And that's kind of another, there's a lot of interesting things. I always kind of look at 17 as one of those chapters in Acts that just kind of, it's just like a pivot point.
yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah, well, and if you look at what his argument was, he was really pretty genius. And, you know, he presented things in a way that they would understand.
right,
Because he didn't quote any scripture. He,
Right.
he hit them where they were, and he left them with, and we're gonna talk about this actually more next time too, with the responsibility for what they've heard. So they could either accept that well, they're gonna accept the responsibility one way or the other. It's just how they respond to it.
it's almost like an approach with apologetics as much as it is with the gospel, but he gives them both. He starts with an apologetic to establish the bridge that who God is in a philosophical sense, and then lays that bridge to get them from no God, many gods to the God, and now the gospel. And then he leaves them there with the gospel, and so it's interesting. And it's not unlike what we face today, not at all. It's much the same.
Okay, well, that's all we're gonna do today, and we will start with chapter 18 next time. Every chapter has something really neat in it.
Yeah,
Exciting.
yeah, Acts is pretty amazing.